5 riders approached the isolated homestead just past noon, their shadows stretching long across the cracked earth. Von Decker pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the property, studying the weathered cabin and the old man sitting motionless on the porch, an easy target, a man alone miles from anyone who might hear trouble coming. But when the sun hit that wooden door behind the rancher, Vaughn would see something that made no sense, a mark that shouldn't exist, a symbol that would turn predators into prey in the span of a single breath. Because some mistakes you don't get to walk away from, Silas Brennan had been sitting in the same chair since sunrise, watching the dust devils dance across the empty land. His hands rested on his knees, weathered and scarred from decades of work that had long since stopped mattering. The coffee in his tin cup had gone cold an hour ago, but he hadn't moved to refill it. There wasn't much that made him move these days, not since Alara. The sound of hooves pulled him from thoughts he'd been drowning in for 3 years. 5 men, he counted them, without lifting his head, the way a man learns to count threats when he survived long enough to have a past worth hiding from. They came in loose formation, confident and careless, the kind of men who'd forgotten what real danger looked like. Vaughn dismounted first, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate weight. The others followed, spreading out in a half circle that Silas recognized immediately. Intimidation formation. They'd done this before. Probably worked most times. Afternoon, old-timer. Van's voice carried the false friendliness of a man about to make demands. He hooked his thumbs in his belt, taking 3 steps closer. Nice piece of land you got here, quiet, private. Silas said nothing. His eyes tracked Vaughn's approach, but his body remained still. Name's Decker. These are my associates. Vaughn gestured to the men behind him without looking. We've been riding through these parts, looking at various properties. This one caught our attention. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the porch. Silas watched it settle on his boots. Thing is, Vaughn continued, his smile fading into something harder, a man your age living out here alone? Well, that's just asking for trouble. Accidents happen, houses catch fire, livestock wander off. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air between them. Smart man might consider an offer. Move somewhere safer, closer to people. One of the riders behind Vaughn laughed. Sound without humor. Silas finally moved, but only to set his cup down on the porch beside his chair. The tin made a soft scraping sound against the wood. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, worn smooth by years of saying nothing at all. Not interested. Vaughn's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected resistance. Men like Silas were supposed to fold to understand when they were beaten before the beating even started. He took another step forward, close enough now that his shadow fell across the old man's boots. You misunderstand me, friend. This isn't a negotiation. The 4 men behind Vaughn moved closer, their hands drifting toward weapons they carried openly. The message was clear. Silas could leave on his own, or he could be carried out. Either way, this land would change hands before sunset. But Silas didn't move, didn't flinch. He looked up at Vaughn with eyes that held something the younger man couldn't quite read. Not fear, not anger, something deeper, something that had been carved into him by losses these riders couldn't imagine. Then we have a problem, Silas said softly. Van's hand shot out, grabbing Silas by his worn shirt and yanking him up from the chair. The old man's body moved with the force, offering no resistance, but his eyes never left Van's face. And in that moment, something shifted, something Vaughn would remember later when understanding came too late. Because behind Silas, carved deep into the wooden door of his home, was a mark these men hadn't noticed yet, a symbol that would change everything they thought they knew about the frail old man they'd chosen to destroy. The other. For men closed in a moment. Van's hand found Silas's shirt. They'd seen this dance before. The old man would crumble, beg, maybe certainly comply once he understood how badly this could go for him. But Silas just stood there in Vaughn's grip, his face calm as still water. You hard of hearing, old man? One of the riders, a lean man with a scar, splitting his eyebrow, stepped onto the porch. Boss just made you a generous offer. Silas's eyes shifted to the newcomer, then back to Vaughn. Still no fear, still that unnerving quiet that made Van's grip tighten without him meaning to. "Let me paint you a picture," Vaughn said, his voice dropping lower. "We're not the first men who've looked at this land, but we're the last ones you'll refuse, you understand me." Silas spoke so softly the men had to lean in to hear. "I understand you perfectly." It wasn't the words that made Van's jaw clench. It was the tone, like a man talking to children who didn't know better, like someone explaining simple facts to people too foolish to see them. Vaughn shoved Silas backward. The old man stumbled, but caught himself against the porch railing, still watching with those steady eyes that held too much knowledge and too much grief to care about threats from men with weapons. "Search the house," Vaughn ordered. Two of his men moved toward the door. As they pushed inside, Vaughn noticed details he'd missed before. The porch was worn but carefully maintained, every board fitted tight, no rot, no careless repairs, the kind of work a man does when building matters more than just shelter. And there beside the door, carved into the frame at eye level, patterns wound through the wood, deliberate, intentional, strange. Inside, the men were tearing through Silas's home. The sound of breaking pottery reached the porch, a trunk being overturned, furniture scraped across the floor. "Not much here, boss," one called out. "Few supplies, old clothes, some kind of bead work on the walls." Bead work. Vaughn filed that away without understanding why it mattered yet. The scarred man grabbed Silas by the arm, fingers digging into weathered muscle. "Were you keeping your coin, old-timer?" "Every man's got something worth taking." Silas pulled his arm free with surprising strength. The movement was economical, practiced, not the fumbling of an aged rancher, but the precise motion of someone who'd learned long ago how to break holds. And when the scar man's face darkened, his fist came up fast, catching Silas across the jaw. The old man's head snapped sideways and blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. He steadied himself against the railing, but didn't go down. "That's for wasting our time," the scarred man said, shaking his hand out. Van watched Silas wipe the blood with the back of his hand. Still no begging, no pleading, just that same terrible calm, like a man who'd already lost everything that mattered and couldn't be touched by anything these riders could do. "You've made your point," Silas said quietly. "Now leave my land." The scarred man hit him again, harder this time. Silas's knees buckled, and he went down on the weathered boards of his porch. Blood dripped from his split lip onto the wood he'd laid himself years ago, when this place still meant something beyond memory. Van crouched beside him, close enough to smell the old man's sweat and the copper tang of fresh blood. "Last chance, you. Walk away now. We'll let you stay stubborn, and you won't walk anywhere ever again." Silas looked up at him, and for just a moment, Vaughn saw something in those eyes that made him want to take a step back. Not fear, not pain. Recognition, like Silas knew exactly how this would end. And it wasn't the way Vaughn thought. "You should leave," Silas said through bloodied teeth. "While you still can." The threat from a beaten man on his own porch should have been laughable, should have been the final proof that the old fool didn't understand his situation. But something about the way Silas said it made the hair on Van's neck stand up behind them. Carved deep into the door, none of them had really looked at yet. A symbol waited to be seen. The scar man's boot caught Silas in the ribs, driving what little air remained from his lungs. The old man curled instinctively, trying to protect himself, but another kick found his shoulder and rolled him onto his back. Blood ran from his nose now, mixing with the split lip, staining the porch boards beneath him. Van stood over him, victory written across his face. This was how it always ended. Resistance crumbled, pride broke. Men learned their place in the natural order of things. "Drag him off the porch," Van said, turning toward his horse. "Let him think about his choices while we figure out what this property is actually worth." Two of the men grabbed Silas under his arms, hauling him toward the steps. His boots scraped across the boards, leaving thin trails in the dust. They dropped him in the dirt at the base of the porch, where he lay, gasping each breath of visible struggle. The youngest of Van's riders, a kid barely 20 who'd been quiet through most of the violence, stood on the porch, looking uncomfortable. His eyes kept drifting to the items scattered inside the house. Beadwork, woven patterns, things that didn't match a lone white rancher living. In isolation, boss, the kid called out, his voice uncertain. You should see this, then turned back, irritation flashing across his face. See what? The kid pointed at the door, at the symbol carved deep into the wood, now visible in the full light of noon. It was intricate, precise, circles within circles for directions marked across. Pattern that meant something beyond decoration. Vaughn climbed the steps slowly, his earlier confidence faltering. He'd seen that mark before, years ago, on a trading post near Cherokee territory. The man who owned that post had been untouchable. Even the worst raiders gave him wide berth, not from fear of his weapons, but from fear of what that mark represented. Protection, sacred protection, given only to those the Cherokee considered family. No, Vaughn said, the word barely, eh? Whisper, his hand reached out, fingers tracing the carved lines without quite touching them. No, this can't be here. The scarred man stepped closer, following Vaughn's stare. When recognition hit him, his face went pale. That's a Cherokee mark. I can see what it is, Vaughn snapped, but his voice had lost its edge. Boss, we need to leave. The scarred man was already backing toward the steps. If he's protected by them, if they find out, we... Shut up, let me think. But Vaughn's thoughts were racing too fast to catch. A white man with Cherokee protection, a mark that's sacred, that permanent. Carve into his door, that meant family, that meant bonds deeper than treaties or trade agreements, that meant they'd just beaten a man the Cherokee would ride to defend. Down in the dirt, Silas had pushed himself up to sitting. Blood covered the front of his shirt, dripped from his chin, but his eyes were clear. He was watching them realize what they'd done. I told you to leave, Silas said, his voice rough, but steady. While you still could. Van's mind scrambled for logic, for a way this could still make sense. You're white. You can't have that mark. You can't. My wife carved it. Silas said simply 3 winters before she died. Said it would keep me safe when she couldn't anymore. The words landed like physical blows. A Cherokee wife. Years of living among them, bonds formed through love and loss. The kind that didn't break when death came calling. The kind that meant warriors would ride if one of their own was violated. The scarred man was already at his horse, hands shaking as he grabbed. The res, we're done here, we're leaving now. But Vaughn stood frozen, staring at that mark and understanding too late that they hadn't found an easy victim. They'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than an isolated old man. They'd violated someone under Cherokee protection, and in these territories, that was a death sentence no amount of riding could outrun. In the distance, so faint it might have been imagination, the sound of hoof beatots carried on the wind. Van's men scattered toward their horses with the urgency of men who'd just realized they were standing in a trap. The youngest rider had his foot in the stirrup when Van's voice stopped him. Cold. Wait. Van's eyes were fixed on the horizon, calculating how far out are they. The scarred man followed his gaze. The dust cloud was still distant, maybe 20 minutes of hard riding away. But 20 minutes wasn't enough, not when Cherokee riders knew these lands better than any map could show, not when they were already coming. We can make it to the Canyon Pass, the scarred man said, but his voice lacked conviction. Cut through the narrow trail, lose them in the rocks. Van shook his head slowly. They know that pass better than we do. They'd have it covered before we got halfway through. He turned back to Silas, who had managed to push himself upright against the porch steps. Blood had soaked through the old man's shirt, but his breathing was steadier now. Waiting, how many? Vaughn demanded. Silas wiped blood from his mouth with his sleeve. Enough. That mark doesn't make you untouchable, Van said, but the words rang hollow even to his own ears. You're still just one old man. I never claimed to be anything else. Silas's eyes held steady on Vaughn's face. But that mark makes me their family, and family is everything to them. The kid who'd first spotted the mark was pacing now, his hand hovering near his weapon. Without actually touching it, we could explain, tell them it was a mistake, that we didn't know. Silas's laugh came out wet and painful. You beat a man on his own land. Traor through his home. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. Van studied the approaching dust cloud. There had to be a way out. There was always a way out. For men smart enough to see it, his mind raced through options, discarding each one as fast as it formed. Fighting was suicide. Running was pointless. Surrendering meant admitting they'd knowingly violated Cherokee protection, which carried its own death sentence. How long have you had that, Mark? Vaughn asked, stalling for time. His brain could use to find an angle. Any angle? 8 years, Silas said quietly. Since the winter, Alara carved it. Said it would keep me tied to her people even after she was gone. Where is she now? Buried on the hill behind the house, where she can see the sunrise. Silas's voice cracked on the words, the first real emotion he'd shown since the violence began, same fever that took. Half her village 3 winters back. The scar man had his rifle out now, checking the load with shaking hands. Boss, we need to decide, stand and explain or ride and hope. Vaughn looked. From the approaching riders to Silas, then to the mark carved deep into that wooden door, a mark that represented years of trust earned, of a love strong enough to bridge worlds that normally didn't touch, the kind of bond that meant warriors would ride hard and fast to defend it. No matter how far they had to come, put the rifle away, Vaughn said. Finally, we stand. The scarred man's face twisted. You're choosing to face them after what we did? We don't have a choice anymore. Van's voice had gone flat, defeated. The moment we touched him, we were already dead. Question now is whether we die running like cowards or face it standing still. Silas shifted against the steps, pain written across his weathered face. There's a third option. Vaughn turned sharply. What option? The truth. Silas met his eyes without flinching. Tell them exactly what happened, that you didn't know, that you made a mistake. Ask for mercy instead of demanding it. Cherokee don't show mercy to men who attack their family. They show mercy to men who own their mistakes and mean it. Silas pushed himself fully upright, swaying slightly, but you have to mean it. They'll know if you're lying. The hoof beats were clear now, no longer just distant thunder, but distinct. Sounds of multiple riders approaching fast. Vaughn could make out individual shapes in the dust, count the horses. 7 riders, maybe 8. His hand drifted to his weapon, then fell away. Silas was right. There was no fighting this. There was only the truth delivered honestly, and hope it was enough to keep them breathing past sunset. The Cherokee riders came hard and fast. Their horses, kicking up columns of dust that caught the afternoon light, they pulled up 30 feet from the porch in a formation that spoke of military precision and years of riding together. 7 men, all armed, all watching Vaughn's group with eyes that had already judged and found them wanting. The lead rider dismounted smoothly, his movements economical and controlled. He was older than the others, maybe 50, with silver threading through long dark hair tied back from his face. His eyes went immediately to Silas, taking in the blood, the injuries, the way the old man held his ribs. Something passed across his face then, not anger, something colder, something that made Van's throat go dry. Silas, the word came out gentle. Concerned, the rider moved past Van's men, as if they weren't there, crossing the distance to where Silas leaned. Against the steps, he crouched beside him, one hand on the old man's shoulder. What happened here? They didn't know. Takakota. Silas's voice was strained but firm. They didn't see the mark until after. Takakota's eyes flicked to the door, to the carved symbol, then back to Silas's battered face after they did. This to you? Yes, Takakota stood slowly, turning to face Vaughn's group. The other 6 Cherokee riders had dismounted now, forming a loose half circle that mirrored the intimidation pattern Vaughn's men had used earlier, but this felt different, more dangerous. These men carried their weapons with the ease of people who knew exactly how to use them and had done so before. Explain, Takakota said. Not a request, a command. Van stepped forward, forcing himself to meet those dark eyes. We came looking at land, didn't see anyone was living here under protection, thought he was just another rancher, alone, vulnerable. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. We were wrong. You beat him. Takakota's voice remained level, but something in it made the hair rise on Van's arms, tore through his home, threatened him on land that is sacred to us because she made it so. The mention of she made Silas's eyes close briefly, pain that had nothing to do with broken ribs. Era was my sister's daughter, Takakota. Continued speaking to Vaughn, but clearly meant for Silas to hear when she chose this white man some village. Questioned it, said it would bring trouble, that his world and ours shouldn't mix. He paused, looking back at Silas. She told them, love doesn't ask permission from worlds. It just exists, and you either honor it or you don't. Silas's voice came quiet. She was wiser than both our peoples combined. She was Dakota, turned back to Vaughn. When the fever came, Silas rode 3 days without stopping to bring our medicine man. Gave up half his supplies to feed families who'd lost their hunters. Sat with the dying when their own relatives were too frightened to come close. He let that sink in. This man earned that mark through sacrifice, not simply through marriage. Do you understand what that means? Van nodded, not trusting his voice. It means he is one of us. Blood doesn't make family. Actions do. Choices do. Standing beside people when it costs you everything that makes family. Takakota's hand rested on the knife at his belt, not threatening, but present. You attack family. What do you think we should do about that? The scarred man spoke up, his voice cracking. We didn't know. We swear we didn't know. Ignorance doesn't wash blood off wood. One of the younger Cherokee riders said. Takakota raised a hand, silencing him. No, but it does separate the cruel from the careless. His eyes moved over each of Vaughn's men in turn, weighing something Vaughn couldn't name. Cruelty deserves no mercy, but carelessness can learn. Silas pushed himself away from the steps, standing despite the obvious pain. Takakota, they were leaving when you arrived. They saw the mark. They understood their mistake after they beat you. After they beat me, Silas agreed, but before they did worse, he met Takakota's eyes with something that looked like pleading. Era wouldn't want blood spilled over this, not if it can be avoided. Takakota was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Vaughn heard his own heartbeat loud and fast in his ears. Finally, the Cherokee leader spoke. Era always did have a softer heart than the rest of us. Takakota stood silent for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes. His eyes moved from Silas's battered face to the mark on the door, then to each of Vaughn's men in turn, weighing, judging. The other Cherokee riders remained perfectly still, waiting for their leader decision with the patience of men who understood that justice took time. Finally, Takakota spoke. Strip your weapons, all of them. Place them on the ground at your feet. Vaughn hesitated, only a moment before unbuckling his belt, letting his revolver fall to the dust. The others followed, some faster than others, until 6 weapons lay in the dirt like offerings. Now your knives. More hesitation. A knife was often a man's last defense, his final tool for survival, but Takakota's expression left no room for negotiation. One by one, blades joined the revolvers in the dust. You came here to take from a man who'd already lost everything, Takakota said. You saw weakness where there was only grief. You mistook solitude for vulnerability. He walked slowly around the pile of weapons, his boots stirring small clouds of dust. In my culture, we believe every action carries weight. What you do comes back to you, sometimes in this life, sometimes in the next, but it always comes back. Van's throat felt tight. What do you want from us? I want you to understand what you almost destroyed. Takakota gestured towards Silas. This man sat with my dying relatives when no one else would. He dug graves until his hands bled because our men were too sick to lift shovels. He gave away food he needed himself because children were starving. His voice grew harder, and When my niece died in his arms, he carved her name into that hillside stone with his own hands, working through 2 nights without sleep to make sure she had a marker worthy of her spirit. Silas turned away, but not before Vaughn saw fresh grief cross his face. So here's my judgment, Takakota, continued you. Will repair everything you damaged in his home, every piece of pottery, every broken board. You will work until it looks the way it did before you entered. He paused, and then you will ride to the trading post at Stone Creek and tell them what happened here. Tell them you attacked a man under Cherokee protection. Tell them what we allowed you to keep your lives, the scarred man's face had gone pale. That'll mark us. No one will trade with us. We'll be finished in this territory. Yes. Takakota said simply. You will be marked just as you marked Silas with your violence. The difference is his marks will heal. Yours will follow you as long as you draw breath in these lands. It was a death sentence of a different kind, not quick, not clean, but absolute. A man marked as someone who'd violated Cherokee protection would find no welcome anywhere the Cherokee traded, and they traded everywhere. Vaughn looked at the weapons in the dust, then at Takakota's impassive face. There was no negotiating this, no talking there. Way around it. They'd made their choice when they laid hands on Silas. Now they lived with the consequence. We'll do it, Vaughn said quietly. All of it good. Takakota turned to his men, speaking in his own language. 2 of them moved to gather the weapons, carrying them toward their horses, not confiscating them permanently, Vaughn realized, but making sure they wouldn't be within reach while the work was being done. Silas had lowered himself back to sitting on the porch steps, his hand pressed to his ribs. One of the younger Cherokee riders approached him with a leather pouch, offering what looked like dried herbs. Silas took them with a nod of thanks, chewing slowly despite the pain it clearly caused. How long do we have? Vaughn asked. Takakota looked at the sun, calculating. You have until sunset tomorrow. After that, you ride for Stone Creek and deliver your message. He met Vaughn's eyes directly, and then you never come within sight of this land again. If we see you here, if we hear you spoke Silas's name anywhere except to tell your story of shame, there will be no mercy, no second chances. Do you understand? Yes. Then get to work. The work took most of the remaining daylight and all of the next morning. Van's men moved through Silas's home with careful hands, piecing together broken pottery with strips of wet leather, straightening furniture they'd overturned, sweeping dust from corners they disturbed. The Cherokee riders watched from the porch, their presence a constant reminder of what would happen if the work was done poorly or left incomplete. Silas sat in his chair, the same one he'd been in when they'd first arrived. His ribs were wrapped now, courtesy of the Cherokee riders, who'd insisted on tending his injuries. The swelling around his eye had gone down slightly, but the bruises had deepened to purple and black. He watched the men work with an expression that was hard to read, not satisfaction, not anger, just tired observation. By late afternoon, the youngest of Van's riders approached the porch, his hat in his hands. Sir, we found some beadwork torn down. Don't know how to fix it proper. Silas looked at the pieces in the young man's hands. Patterns had made, her fingers working through long winter evenings by firelight. His chest tightened. Leave them, he said quietly. I'll tend to those myself. The kid nodded but didn't move away immediately. Can I ask you something? Silas waited. How'd you know they'd come? The Cherokee. How'd you know they'd arrive in time? I didn't. Silas shifted in his chair, wincing, but I knew if they didn't, I'd already made peace with dying on this land. Same land she's buried in. Didn't seem like such a bad way to go. The young rider looked uncomfortable. I'm sorry for what we did, for what I was part of. Being sorry doesn't undo it, Silas said, but it's a start. Remember that feeling. Use it to make better choices next time someone looks vulnerable to you. The kid nodded and returned to work. As the sun began its descent, Takakota walked the property with Silas, checking the repairs. Everything had been restored as much as possible. The home looked lived. And again, if still bearing the invisible marks of violation that no amount of work could completely erase. You could come back with us. Takakota said quietly. Stay with the village. You shouldn't be alone out here. This is where she is, Silas replied, his eyes drifting toward the hill behind the house. I can't leave her. She's not in the ground, old friend. She's in your heart. She goes where you go, I know. Silas's voice cracked. But I'm not ready. Maybe I never will be. Takakota placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. The offer stands always at sunset. Vaughn and his men mounted their horses. Their weapons had been returned, but they sat different in their saddles. Now, smaller, somehow, marked by shame that would follow them through every trading post and settlement they passed. Vaughn looked back at Silas one final time. The old man had stood, despite obvious pain, watching them prepare to leave in the fading light. The Cherokee mark on his door seemed deeper, darker, more permanent than any shadow. I won't forget this, Vince said. Good, Silas replied. That's the point. The 5 riders turned their horses toward Stone Creek, toward the story they'd have to tell, toward lives that would never quite be the same. The Cherokee riders mounted as well, falling into formation. Around them, escort and guard combined. Takakota was the last to leave. He clasped Silas's arm in the traditional way, then mounted his horse. We'll check on you regular like whether you want it or not, I know. And if you change your mind, I know, Silas repeated softer this time. Then they were gone, dust rising behind them in the dying light. And Silas stood alone on his porch once more. The silence settled back over the land like a familiar blanket, heavy, complete, the way it had been every day since Alara died, and would likely be every day until he joined her on that hill. He lowered himself back into his chair, feeling every bruise, every broken rib, every year of age that sat. In his bones, his fingers traced the armrest she'd helped him build, back when everything was still new and full of possibility. Tomorrow he would mend her beadwork. Tonight he would just sit here and remember. Morning came with the kind of silence Silas had grown used to. No voices, no movement beyond his own. Just the wind moving through the empty land and the sound of his own breathing, still painful from broken ribs that would take weeks to heal properly. He sat at the small table had insisted on building, her beadwork spread before him. Like pieces of a puzzle he needed to solve, his fingers, stiff with age and swollen from yesterday's violence, worked slowly through the patterns, blue and white, earth and sky, the colors she'd favored because they reminded her of the world in balance. It took him most of the morning to repair what had been torn down. His stitching wasn't as neat as hers had been. His hands lacked her precision, her natural understanding of how threads should flow. But he worked with care, with attention, with the kind of focus that came from knowing. This was one of the last physical pieces of her he had left to tend. When he finished, he hung the beadwork back in its place above the window where morning light would catch it, the way she'd intended, the way it had hung for 8 years until yesterday, changed everything and nothing at the same time. The walk to her grave took longer than it used. To every step pulled at his injured ribs reminded him of his age, of how close he'd come to joining her on that hillside. Part of him had welcomed it yesterday, the idea of being done, of laying down next to her and letting everything else fall away. But he was still here, still breathing, still bound to this land by more than just memory. Her marker stood simple and solid. The stone he'd carved with her name and the years of her life. Not enough years, never enough. He'd added symbols she would have recognized, patterns that meant something in her language that his people had no words for. Home, heart, forever. Silas lowered himself carefully to sit beside the grave, his back against the stone marker. From here, he could see his cabin below, smoke rising from the chimney he'd rekindled this morning. The door with its carved mark faced him directly, visible even from this distance. That mark had saved his life yesterday, not through power or force, but through the simple truth of what it represented, family bonds that didn't break when death came calling, love that translated into action, into people who rode hard to protect one of their own. even when that person didn't share their blood. All had carved it, knowing he'd need protection someday. Not for violence necessarily, though that proved true enough, but from the kind of loneliness that makes a man forget he still has reasons to wake up each morning, from the grief that whispers it would be easier to just stop trying. She'd given him family when she carved that mark. Not just her family, but the idea of family itself. The understanding that you don't face the world alone if you don't choose to. That connections matter more than comfort. That being part of something larger than yourself means shouldering its weight and accepting its gifts in equal measure. Takakoto would come back. He'd said as much. The visits would be regular whether Silas wanted them or not. The thought should have irritated him. He'd chosen solitude after all. Chosen to exist in this space between memory and present without interference. But sitting here beside her grave, ribs aching, face still swollen from yesterday's beating, he found he didn't mind the idea of visitors as much as he thought he would. Maybe that was growth, maybe it was just exhaustion, or maybe it was finally understanding what that mark on his door had been trying to tell him all along, that the best way to honor the dead isn't to join them before your time, but to keep living in a way that proves their love wasn't wasted. Silas pushed himself up slowly, every movement deliberate and painful. He touched the stone marker once, fingers tracing her name the way he'd done 1,000 times before. Then he walked back down the hill, toward his cabin, toward the marked door that stood between him and everything else, toward the life he'd keep living because she believed he was worth protecting. The Cherokee mark caught the afternoon sun, its carved lines deep and permanent. A promise kept, a bond unbroken, a reminder that some things survive violence, survive loss, survive everything except forgetting, and Silas wasn't ready to forget. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage meets destiny in the untamed frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.